Welcome to our Lotterywest Heritage Conversation at the National Trust. I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. We have for many years had those words written on the back wall there as part of the narrative of this place. I'll have a go at it. I'm not terribly good at Noongar, but it's something like Yorwal Kurl, Windang Wurlap, Jinjin Guinea, which says, welcome here to the old place of sky watching, which of course is entirely appropriate for tonight. So tonight's Lotterywest Heritage Conversation is part of the 2022 Western Australian Heritage Festival, which is supported by Lotterywest. As the only state government-owned lottery agency in Australia, where all of the profits are returned to the community, Lotterywest is committed to supporting Western Australian community groups, and we thank them from the bottom of our heart for the support that enables us to provide events such as these to support our heritage. And may I say that if you happen to go past a lottery kiosk, every time you buy either a scratchy or a lotto, if you don't win, we do. So we are great supporters of Lotterywest in our own right. I'd like to especially welcome Dr Janet Baldwin, who's going to deliver the talk tonight. So the Old Observatory, this is a place which we are very privileged to call home, but which has really been a place of science since the end of the 19th century. Originally the residence of Western Australia's government astronomer and the officers for the observatory, 2022 marks 125 years since the building that we refer today as the Old Observatory was completed. Now, the central office for the National Trust in Western Australia, we're celebrating this milestone with a few offerings. Tonight's talk by Dr Baldwin, and we're also commissioning a short film which we'll make available to our members and others soon after it's finished. Janet is an accomplished oral historian and researcher, graduating from university in 2007 with her doctorate in history. Janet has based many of her research projects and publications, such as the oral history of the Perth Observatory and Out and About with Artemis and oral history interview recording. So we're really looking forward to Janet's story tonight. Thank you so much for taking time to deliver this for us and to enthrall our members, as I know you will. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I must say that I'm not an astrophysicist or an astronomer. I know that Mars is a long way away and Jupiter is even further, but in between there's the asteroid belt. If you have any technical questions and I can't answer them, then there's lots of people at the Bickley site, and I'll refer to the present observatory as the Bickley site and this site as the observatory this evening, but there's lots of people I can ask questions of. So, the observatory, as Julian said, was established in 1896. The Premier Forest wanted an observatory. There's many reasons for an observatory in a city. The Adelaide Observatory had been established along with the one in Melbourne and Sydney. And Perth was a new city, of course, and the weather and the climate had been monitored since the first pioneers came. And the information was disseminated to other observatories in Australia and also the rest of the world. Seismology was also important throughout Australia. We do have earthquakes here, and they have been monitored since the establishment of the observatory here too until about 1958, and then it was moved up to Mundaring. timekeeping was essential for shipping, for rail, businesses and people, clocking in and clocking out, and if they didn't do it with a clock, then there was a clerk sitting there monitoring people coming and going. The stars and the planets really took a back seat. No one was really interested in the stars. Many, of course, came from Europe, although I do acknowledge Aboriginal people used the stars in many, many ways, and also the planets. But the Europeans could see them in this beautiful climate. Perth is clear. It is still clear compared to many cities in the world. But they weren't really interested in the stars. Two jobs that Forrest wanted completed when he set up the observatory, almost to put Perth on the map, and that is to find or determine the coordinates of Perth. And they are 132 degrees south with some minutes, and also 115 degrees east. And that wasn't known. We had to have a central point so that the surveying would make sense. There had to be 3 places of known coordinates. So one would be a star, the other one would be Perth, and then if people wanted to survey a piece of land, then they would have to, the third point would be determined, so then the correct coordinations would be made. Hope that makes sense. But surveying was extremely important. Most of the government astronomers were surveyors, including the last one here, which was Hyman Spiegel. And shipping, of course, extremely important for ships coming into the port, and it was all about longitude and latitude. Most mariners can navigate north to south or south to north, but they had difficulties moving to east to west and west to east. And as you know, we have lots of shipwrecks along the west coast and in other parts of the world as well, until a chronometer was developed by John Harrison in England. And when ships came into the port of Fremantle, and indeed Albany, before Fremantle Port was built, then they would expect the observatory to standardise their instruments, their chronometers. So, extremely important to have an observatory. Mount Eliza was established in 1896. John Forrest had asked for money 3 years prior to that to set up the observatory, and he was successful the second time in 1895. And the observatory was built. There's a residence, also working areas for the astronomers, and also the domes as well, which have all been taken down, but we do have the residence and also the office space in this beautiful building. He invited William Cook to be the first government astronomer. Forrest was a friend of Charles Todd, who was the government astronomer in South Australia, and he recommended William Cook because Cook was his assistant. And Charles Todd also advised the architect, who was Temple Poole, the colonial architect, on the type of building that was required. So Temple Poole designed the building itself. So William Cook arrived just at the, well, he wasn't here when the observatory was ready to be open. He was overseas. He was looking for instruments, telescopes and other up-to-date modern, what he would refer to modern instrumentation to use at the observatory. And when he came back, then he collated all of the weather reports. There were about 50 years of them. He had an assistant, Mr. Jocelyn. Sorry, I can't remember his first name. And he also helped. And then the telescopes arrived. The first one was the Meridian, and that's a telescope that moves from south to north, and there's an imaginary line called the Meridian. It's used for timekeeping. So when stars move across the meridian, they appear to be moving from east to west because of the rotation of the Earth, and they are observed, recorded, and the time was then set with that movement. And then the clocks, which were here at the observatory, Kohlberg clocks, and I believe that they were underground. And then the time would be set. But it took 2 years for the telescopes to arrive, because they weren't off the shelf. They had to be made especially for the observatories. After Cook came Harold Kerr-Lewis and then Hyman Spiegel. Cook and Kerr-Lewis lived on site, but Hyman Spiegel chose not to, mainly because I believe he felt more at home in Mount Lawley. His family were of Russian descent and he was Jewish. During the war years, and he was government astronomer during the war years with just one assistant, then he felt very insecure, and his nephew told me that as a young man, he was only about 30, used to go down into Perth for business, and women would often ask him why he wasn't in uniform and why he wasn't so I think he felt that he was more secure at home in Mount Lawley. So the chronometers were used here, the Kohlberg clocks. They were German clocks, but they were manufactured in England. The manufacture moved to England, and the Shorts clocks were something that Spiegel wanted here at the observatory because they were more accurate than the Kohlbergs. And the accuracy when they are in the correct environment, they would lose 1 second every 4 years. But within 10 years, they were obsolete. As I discussed earlier on, Bruce came early, and a lot of the instrumentation that was used the turn of the century and even in the 1960s, of course, is now obsolete. And there's also the Benson clock, which used to be outside the gates of King's Cross. I was asked to talk about the women who worked at the observatory. They worked behind the scenes, and they were not allowed to use the telescopes. Men used the telescopes, but they were there to read the plates that were produced. An image was produced and they would read the plate. But I must first say that Cook, when he went to Europe, he also went to the Paris Observatory, and he learnt of a project which had started in 1887, and it was mapping the sky, and many observatories were asked to help to contribute. And the British people at Greenwich decided that they wanted to be part of that particular project. The telescopes, or a telescope, had been developed by the Henry brothers, Paul and his brother, I can't remember his name, and the French expected that the telescopes would be their telescopes, the French telescopes, and of a particular standard, and so would the plates that were going to be used in the telescope, which was called the astrographic telescope, because there was a camera and plates could be placed into the camera, and the telescope would be pointed at a star or at the sky, and the glass plate with emulsion would be exposed, and images were then on the glass plate itself. So the glass plates were 16 centimetres by 16. They had a rounded corner so they could fit into the telescope. An emulsion had been applied, and there's also a grid, which is called a residue grid. And the grid was there because the logic was if the emulsion moved, then so would the grid, so people could still read that particular plate. The British decided, because they were British, that they weren't going to use the French telescopes, they would make their own. And they asked Henry Grubb, who was in, not Belfast, he was in Ireland and Dublin, and he made the telescopes for the British. I'm not quite sure about Melbourne, I think theirs was slightly different, but the one in Perth was the last one that Grubb made, and it arrived here, as I said, a couple of years after the observatory was open. If I show you a plate of Comet Halley, this is in 1910, then you can see the grid on the plate itself. It's a very small plate, they were extremely expensive, and so were the staff who were going to be employed to read the plates. The comet looks quite big, and you will see, or can see, dots as well, or pinpricks on the plates. They're likely to be stars, and that's really what was measured. They would measure the comet as well, but when they were looking for stars, then they would appear as pinpricks. As I said, it was an expensive project, more expensive than Cook perhaps imagined. There were plates taken as soon as the telescope arrived, but in 1907 it was decided that women would be employed to read the plates. They chose women, young women, because they had nimble fingers. They were very patient, usually, subservient too, and trainable. So two came to the observatory, in 1907, and Prudence, I don't know all of the names, the first names of the women. There's very little information about the women. But there were 2 employed in 1907, and then it was decided that they should work as groups of 4. If I show you this slide, these are nuns, they're Sisters of the Holy Child Mary, and they worked in the Vatican on the same project from 1910 to 1921. The instruments that they're using are micrometers, and this woman here, and there's another one the other side of the table, they would take the measurements down. So the women would read the micrometers, read the plate on the micrometers, and this woman would here would write down the coordinates and then make the calculations. So they had to have a great deal of patience. They also had to have good eyesight too. So that's why young women were chosen. And these women probably didn't get paid. This is what they were looking at, the plate with the grid. On the micrometer, they're looking through the eyepiece, they can see the image, and again you can see marks there. There's 3 there, and they would measure them and then make the calculations. So the women also had to be very good at maths as well. Unfortunately, they were paid as clerks, they weren't paid as technical staff. And in 1900 in Melbourne, women who were employed doing a very similar job were paid £40 per annum, which was the clerk's wage. And when the women were employed initially by Cook, then they were paid the minimum wage too. When there were 4 women employed, they asked for a pay rise. And when Cook left, Kerr Lewis took over and was generally very kind to the young women, and he would often ask the commissioner to increase their salaries. And sometimes he was successful and they got a little rise, and other times there was no rise. In 1912, the women, because they weren't wallflowers, they decided that they would take matters into their own hands and asked for a substantial rise. What they wanted was a minimum of £48 per year with a maximum of £96. And for supervisors, they wanted, and they had 1 supervisor, they wanted £96 per annum. And the wages for the astronomer, government astronomer at that time, was £685 per annum. His assistant was £385. Men who used the telescope and read the plates would earn £250. So the women were paid substantially less. They also worked from 9 until 1 o'clock, from 9 to 1, and then from 2 to 5 o'clock, which meant they weren't paid during their lunch hour. They were given a lunch hour, but they weren't paid to sit around and drink tea and eat sandwiches. Kerr Lewis, as I said, was quite kind. He allowed them to have their own room here, at the observatory and their own washroom. And at one point he bought some soap for them, but he was questioned by the secretary, colonial secretary, because it cost far more than soap that was used in other areas of the observatory. So I don't know what was so special, but he obviously hadn't gone through the correct channels to buy the soap. So he tried to be kind to them. I've listed the years that the women worked, and sometime in the early years, 1 year or 2 years, if women became engaged and then married, they were asked to leave the public service. The women were never paid as permanent staff, they were always casual staff. But if they did marry, then they were asked to leave, but I don't know from these figures who left because they intended to marry. Prudence Williams worked here for 11 years and she did eventually marry. And two who remained until 1922, they were known as astrographic assistants by that time, but there are only two of them. And Minnie Harvey she was here a long time too, but she did in fact marry Kerr Lewis. Kerr Lewis left his wife and 4 children and eventually married Minnie Harvey. She was known as Billy, but he waited until his wife had passed away and then he married Billy. So we're not quite sure why women left and whether it was because they were married or not. But as I said, it was exacting work, very tiring, particularly on the eyesight. If I look back at the oral history that I did at the Bickley site, and I also have to thank Lotterywest because it was through a grant that I was able to conduct the oral history, and I'm very grateful for them for that. Then things really didn't change very much in 50 years. When the observatory moved up, was closed here, and this is Hyman Spiegel. As I said, there was few staff here, just a couple. He established many programs, including the Moon Watch, because in the late 50s, because the Americans wanted to land on the moon, so it was a worldwide project. And he also made links with international observatories. And I thought this was a Chevy, and it's not, but he had a car which was similar, and his nephew, George Taylor, used to ride in the dicky seat in the back of his car, and occasionally they would have a party, a birthday party here, and his friends would be invited. The move from Mount Eliza, this is the demolition of the astrograph dome. The Calver was inside when it was demolished, but it was dusted off, it was repaired and stored, and it still works today at the observatory. The government astronomers in Bickley, the first one was Benjamin John Harris, and he was a naval officer, spent some time in Queensland, then he went back to Greenwich, and he set up the programs at Bickley, and this is the building of Bickley. He also liked to employ young women, but they were allowed to use the telescopes, so they were trained to use the telescopes, they were also trained to read the plates as well. when I asked several women about their pay and their conditions, then they said that they would have equal pay with the men doing the same job. And that was in the 1960s and 70s. But they were not offered opportunities to further their education, as men were. They were rostered on when some of the men would go to Curtin University, which was not a university then, or a TAFE centre, it was called Wait, yes. And they would continue their education. In fact, when I asked one of the women if I could interview her, she said no, because she was thinking about suing the government because she was prevented from furthering her education. She took legal advice and decided not to do that. But there are several men who finished their masters, several people who completed their degrees, and many of the men who left the observatory went on to work in computing because they had completed courses then at Curtin. But the women were very competent, and one of the women married. She was employed by Benjamin John Harris. He's known as B.J. Harris. And she went to him one day and said, well, over the weekend I got engaged and I'm going to get married, so when would you like me to leave? And he said, why would I want you to do that if you enjoy working here? And she said, well, the policy is that when women marry in Western Australia, part of the public service, then they're sacked. And he thought it was nonsense and refused to do that. So she stayed, she had several children, and her job was kept open for her to return. Ivan Nickloff and John Harris worked in the observatory here before they moved up to Bickley. Nickloff came in about 1958, and Spiegel, in fact, passed away in his early, he was early 50, in his early 50s, and that's why B.J. Harris took over that role. Then we have Mike Candy, Jamie Biggs, and the last one was Ralph Martin, and then it was turned over to the volunteers. And there's just a few references. This one here, which is Tona Stevenson, she did a lot of research in Perth, Sydney and Melbourne, women who were working behind the scenes. And it's unpublished, but she may have published a book since then. So, not sure how I'm doing for time, but if you have any questions, I'm quite happy to try and answer them for you.
Thank you very much indeed. We do have a bit of time for questions, so if anybody has some questions, I know that Janet would be delighted to answer.
Why did they demolish the there was a tower, obviously, or a building that enclosed one of the telescopes. Why did they demolish it?
In the 60s, the government demolished many buildings because they thought they were of no value. Sometimes the bricks were in fact reused. At Bickley, we have a dome called the Meridian Dome, and the Meridian used to be here as well, but that dome was a wooden dome because it only opened from north to south. as a shutout, whereas the others were metal, and the telescopes could move right around 360 degrees. So the meridian they got rid of, but they built a dome in Bickley, which was also wooden, to put the meridian in. And they used bricks from what was known as the asylum. They had taken, which was at Greylands, so they'd taken an inner wall out and saved the bricks, and they were used at Bickley because they were more stable than bricks coming off from places like Midland bricks, whatever. So they did, in fact, recycle some of the bricks and other things, but they were of little value. And they probably, perhaps like the building in front of the House of Parliament, was a bit of an eyesore. So they took it.
That the building itself has been protected.
Absolutely.
I can add a little to that. Indeed, in the mid-50s, the Stevenson Plan came out, which saw a revolutionary approach to Perth's urban design. Part of that was to find a way which would see all of the government agencies concentrated in this precinct to serve Parliament House. So the idea was developed for 5 administrative buildings to be built on this particular site. Dumar House was the first. There were to be 4 others, which, depending on how you look at it, was either a good thing or a bad thing. And I do think the argument goes both ways, but part of that concept led to the decision to demolish the observatory and to clear the landscape for the construction of these buildings. Fortunately, in part, only the, what do we call the buildings that were demolished?
There were domes.
The domes.
Yes.
So fortunately, only the domes and the associated infrastructure were demolished. The observatory building that still stands was slated for demolition, but there was a strong community campaign to see it retained, and it then was kept as government offices through till the mid-80s. This particular building was constructed in the, I believe, in the 90s or early 2000s. The National Trust at that time had a view that it would be able to service functions on the site. So this was to be a commercial kitchen with the adjacent toilets. That, yeah, that's just another moment in history, isn't it? But it's very useful for us. Anyone over here, sir?
Could I just say before you ask a question that I neglected to say that the telescopes, the plates, the logbooks and calculations have been preserved. All of the calculations are preserved. They're available to see at the Bickley site. It is through Lotterywest that the plates have been scanned, so there's an electronic copy of them as well. But they have over 30,000 plates. And whilst they were looking for stars and objects in the sky, they had to have standard stars and a catalogue made of those readings. And there's over 10,000 stars catalogued in the time of that particular project. So to have that sort of collection in Perth is phenomenal. In Western Australia is also quite extraordinary, and throughout the world it's rare to have all of those, well, a very strong providence for the observatory and the plates. So
indeed.
Yeah.
So question at the back there,
Yes.
sir?
I'm just struggling because somebody demolished a perfectly good building with a chronometer in it.
It's a telescope, with the telescope.
Somebody rescued that, but they otherwise destroyed the building, but presumably that was designed to be destroyed in the demolition as well. And yet, just a very short time, well, first of all, they saved the records, but a very short time thereafter, other buildings on this site were saved. So I'm struggling to see, what event or what personnel change, or was it a change in society where people woke up? Maybe it was the rescue of the telescope. Does anyone know?
Generally, the Perth public were very supportive of the observatory and didn't want it to close. In 1927, there was a move by the government to close the observatory, but it was because people protested that the observatory remained open. And they also did public tours as well as research here, so it may have been part of that too.
Yes, I think some of the history shows, as you demonstrate, Janet, that there was a very, very strong feeling amongst the community that this was one of their places, and the numbers of people that came through on tours and educational forums, were in the thousands every year for quite a niche area of science. So I think it was at the heart of the community in terms of it being a cherished asset. We have another question in the corner.
I was just going to ask, what was the sort of status of being the government astronomer? Where did you fit in the social world next door alongside, say, the government medical officer or the commissioner for railways or whatever else? What prominence did you have as the...
I think pretty high. People regarded the government astronomer as being, a man of science and very well respected. Cook and Coulous, and indeed Spiegel, were very intelligent men, very innovative, and yes, I believe that some people within the government saw their job as essential.
May I ask, if I may, what was the relationship of the government astronomer with the university? Do you know?
At times it wasn't very good,
Oh.
because I believe from about 1950 through to 60, there were professors at the university who wanted to take the stage for research, and the observers and astronomers decided that that wasn't the way to go. So there were quite a number of arguments about who was doing what research. And I believe in the 1970s, many students from UWA would go up to the observatory to conduct their research. And one of them, in fact, did complete his honours and also his PhD whilst he was working at the observatory. And that's Andrew Williams. And his supervisor is the man who set up the Gingin establishment. Yeah, David Blair, Professor David Blair.
And we have a question here, sir.
Wondering, in Sydney, the Old Observatory, they used to get a meridian telescope to set the time during the night.
Yes.
During the day, they would fire a cannon, I think, one of the
Yes.
and a big ball would drop down.
Yes.
So the population at large would know it was 1 o'clock.
Yep.
Did they have the same?
Yes, they did. And it started off what was thought to be a cannon out on the grounds. And then it became a rifle. And then it was gelignite. And they would place it on a plate and set it off exactly at 1 o'clock. And then it would send a signal to the clocks, which were underground. And then there was a signal to the post office and to eventually Wireless Hill, but also Fremantle. But Fremantle also had a cannon and ball there too, which was also set off at 1 o'clock. I did, in fact, interview the horologist who set up the new clock, the Shorts clocks here, his family, Ron Innes. He was in his 80s, and his family still look after the clock, the town hall clock, but he set up the Shorts clocks. They hadn't seen the clock before. It's quite complicated. And they're all delighted when it worked, including Spiegel. But he said that Spiegel was extremely good at timekeeping, and really quite fanatical about it. That's why he purchased the Shorts clocks. But they serviced his stopwatch, which he carried all of the time. And Ron told me about the setup of the 1 o'clock cannon, but it was discontinued in the 1950s because of complaints about the noise, especially from people in Parliament House. It may have woken them up.
In fact, the powder room is still extant. It rather looks like a sort of an outdoor loo. It's just a red brick building with a tin roof, which is still down amongst the trees there. So there's a question here.
It follows on. Why was 1 o'clock chosen as the time for the cannon?
Go back to work.
Well, and you'd only have to fire one cannon. Yes. If it was 12 o'clock, then it would be 12. That would be complete blowout of the budget.
So do we have another question? All right, I think we're there. Thank you so much for your questions. Thank you for your interest. And Dr. Baldwin, thank you very much for your enlightening talk. We do appreciate you bringing your passion for oral history and for the observatory in all its forms to us tonight. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you for your support of the National Trust. And to Janet, thank you very much for an enlightening evening.
Thank you.